Hey there, Ryan Kingsline here. So let's take a look at sculpting a face. Now, you don't see a face right now, just a real simple sphere. I got this sphere by going over to Lightbox, made sure I was in the Project tab, and these are all my special things, but scrolling over here to Default Sphere. Let me just draw on the screen for you where you're going to go. So, number 1, Lightbox, number 2, Project, and number 3, Default Sphere. Get that loaded up so you're looking at it. Now, if you don't know navigation and all that stuff for ZBrush, make sure you check out some of my primer stuff. But basically, I'm going to be down in this area, move, scale, and rotate. And I'm going to be adjusting brush stuff up here. Now, that's about the last I'm going to really go into the kind of nitty-gritty like that. Let's get in and start to sculpt. But we've got a bit of a stopping point here. So, how are we going to sculpt the head? There's a lot of ways that we can do this. There's a lot of approaches that we can take, right? And you can go through history and see these approaches through all kinds of different artists. So you've got Giacometti, right? Who you might think of as more of an abstract painter, or sculptor, sorry, and painter. But he had a very specific process for how he did things. Then there's the classical approach, and then there's the Baroque, and then there's Carpeaux, and there's all these different things and ways. But I want to give you two words to work with right now. Okay, and these two words are really significant, all right? So there is implied or suggested form. I think that's misspelled. And then there is defined, explicit form. I'll give you some painters to look at. Okay, Ingres, French classicist, 18th century. Delacroix, basically the enemy of Ingres. I'll give you some modern guys. Justin Sweet. And I'm giving you the painters here for a reason, because you just look at the image and you're instantly going to see. And Neville Page. Take a look, Google those two guys, just pause the video, go take a look at those two guys so you can kind of understand things. Because the way they work is going to be different. Justin Sweet's more implied, suggested. He's creating atmosphere, which you can do in a sculpt. Neville Page is working more, and Neville can do both. I know Neville. Neville's an amazing guy. He can do both, but what people really go to him for is that really defined form where he's figuring out the anatomy. And you can see that in some of his work for Avatar, where he defines the jaw structure for the flying creatures and defines everything crystal clear. All right. As we go through this, we're going to kind of bounce around, and you're going to find a particular direction that really works for you. And that will lead us into the next section, because we can really paraphrase these as loose and controlled. Right? So loose, suggestive form, controlled, defined form. That's not just form, that's also the way we sculpt. So you got to remember these axes that I use all the time. Okay, this is our how we sculpt, this is our what we sculpt. So we sculpt hard surface, we sculpt soft surface, we sculpt loosely, we sculpt in a more controlled approach. This little axis here pretty much defines, these two axes, define so much of our world. Justin Sweet being up here in the loose, Ingres being down here in the controlled. Now as we go in to sculpt this face, we can do this loosely, or we can do this in a controlled manner. And that distinction is not always made in tutorials, and that's why I'm spending extra time here. Because if you were to watch Steve Lord, okay, Steve Lord, he's an artist. We've done some classes with him. He is amazing, one of the best, if not the best sculptor working in our industry today. It's just stunning work. He works loosely and builds his form so that you don't even know what's happening. You can't even see it, and then suddenly it's there, right? Just suddenly, boom, bang, it's there. And that is hard for you as a learner if you don't know all of the anatomy that he's got running around in the back of his head. You don't have all of that stuff. So you might need something to be more controlled. Let me give you an example. Okay. I'm going to use the Move brush. This is one of the brushes I use to kind of quickly define form. So we're going to do this two different ways. I'm going to first do this loosely. I'm going to pull this out, and I'm going to start to work rapidly. Not because I want to confuse you, but because it builds energy. Okay, and I'm going into draw, and I'm turning angle of view down because for a head, it's too much. Okay, so I'm going to work rapidly because it builds energy. Switching over to the clay buildup brush, I'm going to define some planes and some basic parts of the face and start to establish what I know now and what I consider now to be anatomical notations. You may not know any of this stuff that's going on right now, you know, and this is actually a bit more controlled than Steve would go. He would be a bit much looser about this, I think. So I'm going to switch over to the standard brush. He would be using something like this. The clay buildup brush has this kind of natural tendency towards form. So let's just smooth all of that out, and let's slowly start to build. Now, really important, there's two words here that are going to be floating around in your mind as I sculpt them. Okay, nostril or nose. And one of the things you got to be mindful of when you sculpt is the word that's in your mind is going to be the word or the thing that you sculpt. So if you sculpt a nostril, it's going to make it a nostril, and that's actually not what you want. What you want is side of nose, top of nose, under plane of nose, and then you put the nostril into that. You can see I smooth out a lot. I'll come in and do some kind of rough things are going to build. I'm going to work as quickly as I can so I don't bore you to tears. But you might start to see some of this anatomy already popping up, like slowly evolving. And you just kind of don't even notice it. Like it's just slowly, oh, suddenly there's an eye happening. I'm going to divide this one more time. I'm going to have some fat there. Get the area underneath the eye. Caruncula. Go down in my subdivision. Shift D is the hotkey for that. Right. We're going to build up some form. See how loose that is? Need to check my measurements. Maybe switch over to the Move brush. I have that set up on a hotkey. I'm working loose, and so proportions got out of control. But that's okay. As you get more and more confident with working loosely, that happens less and less. But when it happens, who cares? That's what the Move brush is about. Move brush. Let's say, see if I can't kind of play with this nose. Go up a subdivision level. Okay, it's a big tendency for the eyes to drop too low. And by that I mean, anatomically speaking, a lot of times what we do is we see a block for the orbit of the eye, and we tend to put the eyeball right in the center. That's not where it is. The eyeball is actually protected. It's lifted up a little bit, right? And so a lot of times when we start out, we put our eyes there and we start wondering, why is the nose cramped? And so you extend the nose out, right? And then next thing you know, the lips, and then at the end of the day, you've got your eyes correctly positioned, and everything else is correctly positioned, and you shrunk the head, right? These little things, when you're working loosely, you kind of, it's fine, you know, that's fine that that kind of stuff happens. Because I have my mechanism, I know. Hey, check that. Okay. And again, I'm working fast, but it's not to confuse you, it's for the energy it gives me. Okay, cut in, maybe come over to /3 brush. That was the B key for brush pop-up, S, and then the number 3. Okay. I also have not divided the model, and that's on purpose. Let me do that at a higher subdivision level. Press Alt, and this is with /3, and put the quick browse in there. Quick brow, it's direction, direction, direction. One of the things about working quick is you kind of learn the simple forms that are needed to imply something. Not to be it, not to actually be it in terms of its controlled, absolute, defined form as Ong would sculpt it, but as we can imply it, as Delacroix or an impressionist would imply it. Okay. Now, I'm going to quickly smooth out some of this stuff. I'm going to leave some of the bumps and bruises and all of that in there. But in a matter of 10 minutes, you know, we pulled together pretty quickly a rough, loose form. Now, what do you need to know to be able to accomplish this? Because you might stop this video and try to do this, which would be great. I would love that. Do that. Okay? But before you do that, before you leave me, one thing I need you to remember. Don't judge yourself. Okay? Assess yourself. Don't judge yourself. Assess yourself. So once you've done this, you may not get the same result as I have. You may get better, which is great. Come, teach a class with me. Let's make this world a better place. If your results are not as good, there's a reason, and the reason is not you suck. I repeat, and it's really important to repeat this, you know, because it happened to me, and I felt it so deeply. I felt it like when I made a sculpture that was bad, I felt it like a rejection, like something had rejected me. What sense is that? But your brain doesn't make sense all the time, right? So don't judge yourself, assess yourself. If it's not as good, then why? Relax. What's not as good? What do you need to get there? These are the questions I want you answering. These are the questions I want you thinking. Okay? I'm going to do a quick dissection of some of the anatomical landmarks that are really relevant here that you may not be aware of. So, for example, there's an occipital right here. There's also a superciliary arch that comes down into the glabella, and that's a fairly decently rendered down plane into the glabella. There's also, this one's tricky. There is, what do they call this? The angular process of the frontal bone right here. Okay? And then this connects to this frontocephenoidal process of the zygomatic right there. This thing coming up. What? Right? That's anatomy. Okay? Then there's the eye, and you can see that there's the lower part of the eye. I've got the eye bag, and then somehow magically, you know, it's got a nice little trough that comes into the cheek, the fat of the infraorbital triangle. Basically, this little triangle like that. That's just a bunch of fat. Okay. There's the what do they call this? The alar facial triangle, right there. Yeah. There's the columella. There's the nostril meeting the alar cartilage. I even put in here the nasal bone and the lateral cartilage. You might have seen that little green, or this little stroke I did right here, here, and here. Those were little anatomical notations. I made the upper lip pull in and dive underneath the corner. I took this little line, it's called the marionette line. I pulled that down so that the lower lip would go even further in and separate the lower lip from the upper lip and from the side of the face. The chin comes in right here, the bone. And that dives in underneath the fat, the jowls. Where do the jowls begin? Where do they end? There's a lot wrong with this sculpt. He has no ears. Also, you can see this little line coming down like that. As somebody who's been doing this for a long time, I know what to bother with and what not to bother with. You're going to be learning all of that stuff. And in the beginning, you're going to want to bother with everything, and everything is going to be, it's not right, I'm not right, I'll never be right, and never figure it out. You know, and you'll believe that for a half hour until your passion gets you back into the game. But there's no reason for you to suffer in that way. You just need to understand that you're missing some knowledge. That's it, and that my goal is to provide that stuff to you. Now, you can't sculpt loose unless you have that knowledge. You have to stop and go and do things a little bit more controlled until you get that knowledge into you, and then you go back to loose. So as artists, we are constantly going between loose and controlled when we're in the training room, which is really what this video is all about. You and I, we're in a training room. We're learning today. We're not in the arena fighting and sculpting. We're learning. Okay? And you go back and forth. It's like a tennis player who, you know, is in this very controlled fashion. They're practicing their backhand over and over and over again. And then they go over here and they spar. Right? There's also another really important connection here. And I know I'm giving you a lot of theoretical stuff, but it's really important to establish a fundamental for our conversation. So make sure that you know what myelin is. Myelin is actually the biological source of your skill. The memory of sculpting, form, all of that's stored in myelin. And you can learn more about that from this book called The Talent Code. Amazing book. But in there, in Talent Code, they talk about two different types of circuitry that we have. They talk about a flexible circuit. And they talk about a more of a controlled, consistent is the word they use, circuit. So flexible is something like learning soccer. A consistent circuit is something like learning the violin, which means you got to learn how to hold your bow, because if you don't hold your bow right, the sound won't be right, and you'll damage your hand, and you'll never have a professional career if you don't hold the bow right. If you don't kick right in soccer, well, you can rely on other things. Maybe he's good at defensive. Maybe he's good at, something else. So you've got more of a flexible approach here as opposed to a linear, consistent approach. Keep this in your mind as you're learning, because sometimes you need to go over here and play. Sometimes you need to just practice and get it right, and get it right, and get it right. Now, let me show you the controlled approach, but I'm going to show you that by providing a video I did a while ago that'll walk you through the breaking down of the face into very simple, controlled measurements. So take a look at that.